Okay. I might as well use this minute to start introducing the presenters to this plenary presentation on arts-based speeches. And I welcome here Dr. Birgit Heuer, who is a Jungian analyst of the British Jungian Analytic Association and a lecturer at Birkbeck College, University of London. She has published numerous papers in various journals, such as the Journal of Analytical Psychology and Self and Society, in various book chapters. Her PhD was on sanatology and clinical paradigm of health and healing, and she has lectured internationally on themes such as body and being, forgiveness, spirituality in the consulting room, and on the clinical paradigm. And Roula-Maria Dib, Dr. Roula-Maria Dib, who is the founding director of the London Arts-Based Research Centre, the founding editor of the Literary and Arts Journal Indelible, and the creative producer of the literary event series Indelible Evenings, as well as Psych-Creative, a virtual saloon for researchers and creatives with a background in Jungian psychology. Roula's many achievements have been mentioned before by Mary Beth, and they are presenting, first of all, Birgit on Clouds of Knowing, Deep Reason, and Trans-binarity in Arts-Based Research and Jungian Analysis. And secondarily, Roula will present on Transcending Boundaries, the Crossroads of Arabic Alchemy, Jung, and Creative Research. And I will now let Birgit start.
Yes, thank you. So I would like to begin my talk on a personal note and tell you how arts-based research came into my life. When I started on my PhD, that was in 2007, interdisciplinary research was not in the map in the way it is today. As a Jungian analyst, I was interested in how, as therapists, we relate to our clients, and how this might be based on more general ideas about the world and human nature. For this, I explored the typical language and narratives of case histories, something that had not been done in any systematic way before. However, my research design was creative rather than numbers-based. Clinical language emerged as the language of opposition and war, whilst clinical narrative depended on learning through suffering, and never rested in positive dynamics or clients' positive capacities. My research showed that Jungian clinical work is based on in a highly anxious and somewhat negative view of human nature and the world we live in. This, however, is too similar to the inner landscape that many of the people who approach us for help already experience within themselves. Clearly, then, a different outlook for psychotherapy was needed, and I developed the idea of deep positivity. This is a view of the world that is based in quantum and complexity theories. My PhD embraced empirical science, critical philosophy, via positiva mysticism, and Jungian analysis. In other words, it was interdisciplinary, and I used methods that now would register as arts-based research. A series of very intense and repetitive dreams that just would not let up, for instance, almost pulled me towards conceiving deep positivity. Eventually, this emerged as a domain where complex and implicitly positive dynamics can be shown to be the strongest influence. In other words, this is an outlook of radical hope without overlooking difficulty. It is only more recently, through my involvement with the London Arts-Based Research Centre, that I realized I had also developed a complete epistemology for arts-based research. Epistemology is to do with how our knowledge is constituted, how it comes about in principle. These questions are then more fundamental than which methods we use. In that sense, epistemology is foundational to methodology. Epistemology is to do with the type of thinking we are supposed to use, and therefore what kind of argument is acceptable. This is highly political, as not all forms of generating knowledge are usually equally acceptable. I need to emphasize again that this is not about the methods, but about something much more fundamental, which is usually not discussed and tends to remain hidden. Institutions such as the Academy tend to hold norms in this regard, which are linked to implicit value judgments, which then disqualify some ways of gathering knowledge, such as, for instance, intuitive modes of knowing, or bodily means of knowing, or heart-based ways of understanding. These examples all use forms of resonance rather than ordinary logic. They are ways of knowing in rather than knowing of. Thus, we might know something in our guts or in our hearts. It is only when we ask critical epistemological questions, such as, how does this institution expect me to generate knowledge, and what implicit values is this based on? It is only then that the political aspect becomes visible and available to discussion. Critical epistemology then is a vital tool for arts-based research. By and large, what we find if we look for the epistemological bias in the Academy is to do with the use of ordinary logic, which is binary. This involves a world of differentiation and opposition. It is also a way to tie things down. The world appears divided into neat parcels that can be fully defined and described and measured. There's also a fundamental division between researcher, subject, and the rest of the world. Using ordinary logic, we are not supposed to be intuitive or to know things before we inquire into them. Also, we are not supposed to argue via simile, as we do when we use poetic language or when we employ quotation to evoke an idea. Argument via simile, that is elaborating one idea through another, uses resonance. Something in us is touched or chimed off, and this leads to deeper understanding or insight. The implicit bias of institutions tends to exclude resonance-based ways of knowing. The methods and requirements that follow from this bias are, of course, those of empiricism. Importantly, this bias is usually never spelled out, which creates implicit norms that then appear as if they are just givens, needing no justification. It is only when we step out of ordinary logic and its requirements that its normative function becomes clear, and we can then advocate for a broader approach, or what I call epistemological democracy. I believe that anyone who works in the Academy knows that equality in the politics of knowing is something that still needs a lot of work. However, we are also collectively and culturally in the process of assimilating quantum science, which gives us a very different type of logic, and this, with time, is likely to filter through. So very fortuitously, it's currently from within science that an alternative form of logic emerges, and with it comes a profound readjustment of what we hold to be real. Quantum logic opens up a world that is very different and much more complex. This also means that it can't be fully described in the ordinary way, and that basically ordinary language defies us when we try it. In other words, we are naturally led towards more poetic language, and we can't just use our analytical mind to get to grips with it. In understanding quantum theory, there usually comes a point where our minds get so boggled that our linear logical brains just have to let go. Many people have the experience that when we think we have understood quantum theory, something comes along that topples the edifice, and we have to start all over again. I'm not talking about the mathematical quantum formalism, of course. That is never in question. I am talking about the way our understanding of reality itself shifts. Here we come to something that is at the very heart of this talk, and it is to do with the tiny prefix trans. Quantum logic takes us way beyond the world of binarity, the world of differentiation and opposition and tying things down. I came up with the idea of trans-binarity about 12 years ago, intuitively as part of my work on deep positivity, through what I can only call an intense inner pull. Of course, at the time, everybody was talking about non-binarity. The tiny word trans, however, signifies a world that is radically different. I then realized that non-binarity simply sets up a fresh pair of opposites. Trans-binarity, however, fundamentally loosens the subject-object divide in every aspect of life, whilst at the same time retaining a capacity for difference. As I've mentioned, ordinary logic cuts up the world into neat parcels. In a trans-binary world, though, people and things and research subjects, but also time and place, cannot be kept apart in the same way. However, there's also not just one big soup where everything overlaps. Rather, there are complicated webs of interrelations that follow the patterns and dynamics of complexity theory. Trans-binarity is also translinear. Things don't follow from each other in the usual way. Instead, they co-emerge. There's much more to this, which I will go on to explain a bit later. Yet perhaps you can already see how even with this tiny bit of information, the world of arts-based inquiry in the academy shifts as the implicit norms of empirical research no longer hold. We are then freed up to expand our ways of knowing, and this in turn allows a host of different methods. Engaging with quantum logic eventually opens up a vast epistemological landscape, leading to the idea of deep reason. Here, knowledge expands into a living and all-pervasive aspect of the fabric of reality, rather than something generated separately in our minds or brains only. Knowledge, then, is something that, in principle, pervades the entire cosmos. Deep knowing employs what I call resonatory reason, for quantum processes work like an orchestra. It is to do with wave-like attunement, which creates a sense of overlap between researcher and subject. Resonatory reason is linked to intuition, but not limited to it. It may arise via all Jung's four functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. It also involves a concept of time that is translinear. In other words, or in the words of quantum physicist Professor Karen Barrett, the future is already here and the past is yet to come. In this context, knowing is fluid, all-pervasive, outside as well as inside, and time flexible. It is also intrinsically linked to meaning, purpose, and ultimately love. And I will explain a bit later how this actually comes about and how one can argue this. Now, of course, I need to back up all these statements and make them more accessible to you. Clearly, in this short space, I cannot go into great detail with quantum and complexity theories. I would like to point those of you who are interested towards my psychreative talk on deep positivity. Let me start out with resonatory reason and show how it is a more complex form of knowing rather than a lesser and unscientific one. For this, I need to bring in the more recent history of epistemology. When we consider what is accepted as scientific forms of knowing, we can generally trace a development towards more fluidity. In the earliest 20th century, logical positivism reigned, And logical positivism demands 100% binarity. And this is, of course, the logic of empirical science. Here, only if something is fully the case, i.e. 100%, may it be regarded as a fact. Facts have 100% sharp outlines with no overlap allowed. And this is called Aristotle's law of the excluded middle. Nothing, no gray areas. Thus, the principle of negation defines what is real through complete differentiation. This explanatory landscape is conceptually flat, as everything can be reduced to two distinct elements, yes or no, fact or falsehood. However, this does not mean we should simply discard it. In a trans-binary world, nothing needs to be stripped of its value or thrown away. Today's quantum logic is trans-binary, and it includes, as well as transcends, traditional logical thought. Here, things can easily add up to more than 100%. Moreover, in quantum logic, it might be simultaneously both the case and not the case, as well as either and neither, whilst at the same time, things tend to be more the case than not the case. So there are four logical possibilities that are all simultaneously possible or apply simultaneously. And moreover, things tend to be the case more than not the case. And you can already see, if you imagine that to be the fabric of reality, you can see how wonderfully confusing this is to our logical minds, though perhaps not our intuition. And now for the crucial aspect of quantum logic, the influence of negation, which is absolutely vital to binarity. Remember, everything has to be 100% differentiable. So that influence, the influence of negation, is restricted so that we can only ever reach 66% of separability rather than 100. And it is at this point that the principle of negation itself has fully collapsed, as it needs 100%, as its raison d'etre, so to speak. So it has collapsed at this point. According to its own standards, it should no longer apply at all. Yet it has still a 66% sphere of influence. How can this be? It implies what we might call a powerfully positive connective principle at a higher level of complexity, which outweighs the principle of negation. However, even though there is an enormous power differential, the stronger positive force does not obliterate the weaker one. There is no war. Rather, the stronger, more complex principle somehow embraces and incorporates the weaker one and transforms it in the process. The negative principle has died, yet it's reborn at a new level of complexity. This brings to mind the mystical via positiva, where life is informed by what we might call infinite mercy. In subtle ways, then a trans-binary world is linked to a mystically merciful one. If we try to perceive or describe the world in this way, we see that our logical minds get confused as we can't tie things down in the way we are used to. I always say that with quantum logic or quantum theory, you cannot avoid losing your mind, albeit in the best possible way. As we allow our logical minds to recede, resonance-based modes of knowing emerge. We might feel more inspired to express ourselves in poetic, symbolic, or mystical ways. Quantum logic then forms the epistemological landscape of deep knowing. The modality best suited to this is reason based on resonance. Mystics have always used resonatory reason and have typically received knowledge through their bodies, their feelings, their thoughts, and their intuition. The emphasis here is on received rather than constituted knowledge. As you know, this is often seen as a woolly way of knowing, but I'm showing that it's actually more sophisticated because it's based in higher conceptual complexity. A good example of this type of knowing is Gottfried Heuer's artwork. Gottfried often uses the wings of dead birds in his stone balances. He usually carries these on his body whilst walking to the place he has chosen. Later, he buries the bird in a little ceremony. I remember well one time where Gottfried had to let go of a particularly well-used pair of wings and said to me, "I feel I have come to know this bird so well because I have handled these wings, touched, arranged them, and looked at them so many times. In my heart, I know this bird so well." Here you can see knowing through resonance at work, but also time flexibility, as the bird is no longer alive, yet becomes intimately known. Mentioning the heart brings in another important aspect of this type of reason. Research from the American Institute of Heart Math tells us that our hearts send more information to our brains than vice versa, and that the heart responds to events even before they have occurred. Thus, perception via the heart is an important ingredient in resonatory knowing, and this shines through in Gottfried's comment. We could also say that ordinary reason is reductive, whereas complex reason is synthetic, bringing together many aspects that tend to enhance each other. Binary thought, which is used in empirical research then, emerges as an elective method of apprehending reality rather than a given. So it's elective because we can, with quantum physics, we can show that the nature of reality is not binary or not exclusively binary. And then the empirical methods, which are binary in themselves, are not the only ones. The clarity of this statement brings us epistemological democracy and flow. Equal value is then given to both modes, and they can be selected according to our purpose. And now I need to tell you a bit more about quantum and complexity to back all this up more. Ordinary reason is supposed to be neutral and directly reflect the world we live in. However, in a quantum and complexity world, there are what could be called compelling implicit influences, although no causes can be pinpointed. Complexity theory has so-called strange attractors that underlie seeming disorder and chaos. It also has complex attractors, which always pull towards renewed order at a higher level of organization. It has also bifurcation points where a system divides into aspects that recede into instability, whereas others form new versions of stability. In other words, this is something like radical hope in action, as things never essentially move backwards and are always pulled tide-like towards something more complex, and that is usually something better. We might say that what is unhelpful and no longer needed eventually or sometimes suddenly recedes, whereas there's always something that moves on and thrives. Of course, nothing actually pulls in the way of ordinary causes, or we can't pinpoint what it is that pulls. Rather, the dynamics I have just described are inferred from studying the repetitive patterns found in living systems. In quantum theory, we have what is called a superposition, which is a very high degree of resonance at an almost unimaginable degree of precision. Here, everything is completely aligned and works together like an orchestra, performing a beautiful piece of music, and this dynamic underpins all lived life, including our physical bodies. This means that all spheres of life, which ordinarily we conceive as separate, resonate and form and ultimately co-constitute each other. Thus, the realms of knowing, being, feeling, meaning, purpose, and the spiritual or the divine can no longer be separated from each other. In the world of quantum physicists, in the words rather of quantum physicists, Karen Barrett, they intra-flow, INTRA flow, that is, they inform and constitute each other from within. Essentially, this means that each tiny quantum entity contains the entire cosmos, and yet it is uniquely different from the next one. It contains the entire cosmos, but in a way that is uniquely different from the way this happens in the next quantum entity. It is a complicated relation of intraconnectedness and difference, which confuses our logical minds, yet may make total sense to our intuition. It also implies what in ordinary language we might call instant responsivity. When we combine Barrett's reading of quantum reality with the complexity influences I just mentioned, we can see that at a deeper level, all the intra-flowing aspects of life are continually pulled towards ever more complex forms. Another important bit of quantum research is that both time and place experimentally show quantum properties, and that they can turn into each other in a way similar to the time-space continuum in indigenous cultures. Their way of experiencing extended and overlapping time-space is validated by quantum research. If we think about a world of timeless time that somehow includes the place we are in, we can perhaps see how inspiring this might be for any art-based project. And it's also obvious that ordinary reason is not enough to navigate this territory. There's an artist called Camille Attabak who has created a video of timeless time-space, which she calls Liquid Time, and you can watch her installations on YouTube. It looks a bit like entering a mirror where everything shifts continually, yet we can still see outline and form. And it's actually also interactive, so the visitor to the exhibition can stand in front of the screen and enter in their own experience this liquid time. In combination, all the aspects I have mentioned give us the landscape of trans-binarity. Its modes of knowing embrace all variations from ordinary to resonatory. And it is in this domain that arts-based research really thrives. Of course, I've given you a simplified version of describing something that our logical minds can't grasp. We are constantly pulled beyond comprehending towards deeper understanding through letting ourselves be touched and moved by what the science hints at or the wider vistas it opens. I wanted to find a way of bringing out the implications of the two leading contemporary theories. It is only when we read them together that we can see how profoundly positive, in the sense of hopeful, they are. We are able to say that generally positive dynamics tend to be the stronger ones, yet their influence is implicit and gentle and does not compel. This view is at the core of trans-duality. Whilst I have approached it through logic, essentially it reaches beyond that, and if we allow it, profoundly speaks to our hearts. Thus, ordinary science eventually becomes a heartfelt experience, or perhaps induces an education of the heart. One of the most important aspects of this for arts-based inquiry is the meaningful responsivity that I mentioned. We might say that the heart of the universe tends to respond when we pose a question. A meaningful answer is always trying to constellate in response, and we must find ways of both inviting and receiving it. And of course, this brings us to Jung's synchronicity, his idea of meaningful coincidence. In Trans-binarity, Jung's idea is enhanced and revealed as an intrinsic aspect of the fabric of reality. I would like to note that Jung did not have access to quantum logic. We know that he corresponded with Pauli, the quantum physicist, and their exchange was very inspirational for Jung, but it was never possible to derive any of his theories directly from quantum physics. Whilst Jung's work is, of course, profoundly holistic, his archetypal theory is dualistic. What do I mean by this? Archetypes are Janus-faced and may turn from benign to extremely cruel in an instant. Whilst the pre-modern societies the archetypal world is based in had a more holistic outlook than we do, they were also cruel cultures in ways that tend to offend our sensibilities. My sense is that this aspect of Jung's work, and particularly his central archetype of the self, need to be reconsidered from a trans-binary perspective. In other words, they need to be allowed to catch up with contemporary sensibilities, or we could say they need to be humanized. This is important clinically, particularly when we are working with trauma. Where people have experienced cumulative trauma, their significant caregivers have usually behaved just like archetypes, shifting from helpful to extremely destructive in an instant. Thus, the archetypal world is too similar to the inner world of trauma to help with deeper healing. Archetypes can illustrate the experience of trauma, yet healing also needs imagining and learning a world of safety and calm. Trans-binarity, with its strong tendency towards the benign that I have elaborated, is better suited to constellating healing. Thinking about clinical work organically leads to the final question of my talk. Might we regard the practice of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy as forms of arts-based inquiry? In recent years, there has been a lot of effort within our profession to get in line with empiricism and find research methods that fit those requirements. However, by using sophisticated ABR epistemology along the lines I've explained, we could re-envisage psychotherapy as a creative endeavor. Within psychoanalytic psychotherapy, where was I? Lost my mind. Within psychoanalytic theory, of course, there are many concepts that go beyond the subject-object divide, such as the idea of transference and countertransference, or parallel process, or indeed Jung's Garden Gate diagram. However, our mainstream clinical outlook as such is implicitly binary and oppositional, as research of clinical language and case histories show. How would we reimagine it? Clinical work as creative arts-based inquiry? My sense is this could be incredibly inspiring and freeing. Knowledge would be intrinsic to the relational field, but also received from wider universal sources. It would be less restricted to knowing of and tying things down. We could feel confident that an inquiry into healing tends to constellate response, which has to be invited and harvested. Dialogue between the person we are working with and ourselves might be more spontaneous, writing poetry or making music together, riffing off and inspiring each other. Of course, there needs to be space for tying things down as well. People need to understand why they may feel as they do, or also to connect with any difficult experience they may not have been strong enough to face. Overall, though, an arts-based way of practicing gives much needed fluidity and also a link to therapeutic hope and optimism. Therapist and client then both have access to the greater knowledge within which we live. There would also be more emphasis on being with and knowing in, which ultimately leads to deeper understanding. Recalling the stronger, merciful principle in trans-binarity, we might say that arts-based psychotherapy is a joint inquiry into healing our hearts. In ending, I would like to go back to my title, Clouds of Knowing. This, of course, plays on the 15th century anonymous mystic's title, The Cloud of Unknowing. In a nutshell, in the cloud of unknowing, the divine is yearned for, yet remains eternally unknowable and hidden from us as though by a cloud. It can only be experienced through divine response to our suffering. Thus, the cloud of unknowing emphasizes an unbridgeable distance between human and the divine. It follows the principle of differentiation that I've explained regarding ordinary logic. In trans-binarity, divine and human are linked through resonance, and there is the potential for intimate, living knowledge via intraflow. These ways of knowing are cloud-like in their fluidity, beauty, layeredness, and changeability. They are clouds of knowing. Thank you. Thank you. And we have a bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much.
And comments.
I'd like to comment. Thank you so much, Birgit. That was a beautiful presentation. The cloud of unknowing is the heart of what you were talking about. And in the Red Book, Jung says, if you do not know what divine madness is, suspend judgment and wait for the fruits. So again, you got the binary. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it manifest as this or that? You want the trans-binary, which archetypal psychology moves into transpersonal psychology and also Jung's transcendent function. So that during the medieval time, you would have the via negativa, which again was not this, not that. You fall into the middle where all possibilities are there in the cloud of unknowing. So thank you. It's beautiful.
Thank you for that comment. Yes. Anybody else? Questions? Anything that I can clarify?
Birgit?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, thank you for this brilliant presentation. It's really, as I was listening to you, I was just thinking about time, over time, so much that's been articulated, especially, I think, by women and others who, like I said, the shamans and others, indigenous people who have already been in touch with this knowing, right? And I'm grateful to you to articulate it in this way so we can, you know, bring this point of view in the Western world, in the Western academies, right, of justification in the words often that are used in the academies to be able to show and illustrate, you know, the reality and the truth of what you've articulated here, so that we can use that to take what we know forward in our research and our work. So I feel like such a huge contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that comment. And it's what is important though is it's a combination of both, really, the binary and the trans-binary. And the trans-binary, as I conceive it, is made up of both. Only the the trans-binary or the complexity principle, whatever we want to call it, the one that has all the four possibilities all at once, you know, that confusing principle, is the stronger one. And it is able to embrace and incorporate the ordinary logic, but it somehow really pulls it into another dimension, if you like. And so this is a way of putting something on the map that has a long history and long tradition, but it comes through science. It comes in a new guise, if you like, or it's wearing, it's something very, very ancient, but it's wearing new clothes, but it's wearing them properly. They are not the emperor's new clothes. They're proper clothes.
Yes.
In my...
Yes, very proper. Thank you so much.
Christos.
Thank you so much, and it's such a joy to find out about both these initiatives and on the arts-based work, and also really enjoyed your presentation, which had both the fluidity and the alternate logics kind of weaved in. I have a little question about humanizing the archetypes. I mean, is it really a sense of making them more contemporary, or is it more a sense of, in my mind at least it is, and that's why I kind of bring it forward, a kind of a disconnection, if you would like, from that absoluteness, so that the emotions, the intensities become less unmanageable, that they become more human. So the traumatic aspect, if you would like, or the traumatizing aspect becomes less divine and more something that one can relate to and find ways through and with and so on. So is that what you meant, or did you mean something different? Or I was just very curious to understand.
Yeah. I mean, that aspect is really is open to development. It's just that I see, once I've developed trans-binarity, it has a sensibility. It's not just an abstract building, so to speak, of the mind. It has a sensibility, and that sensibility is that of it's a merciful one. So mercy, embrace, accepting, the other, or that what we find difficult. And so you don't have you don't have the same opposites in the sensibilities anymore, in a sense. But in Jung, which totally makes sense for the time in which he conceived the archetypes, they have the stark opposites. They turn from good to bad. They can be very cruel, and that has a long history. And currently, my sense is that the way we conceive archetypes, or the way we flesh them out, needs to be kind of moved on into something more trans-binary, where the merciful ways outweigh the cruel ways.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, but this is a work in progress, and I hope other people will participate. Very much a work in progress.
Thank you. Dean.
Am I up? Hi. Hello. That was, Birgit, that was a really, really stimulating and wonderful. And I'm looking forward to reading and hearing it again. The sound, I'm not getting good sound through my computer, so I'm struggling to keep up. But I also want to pick up on the question of the archetypes. I was astonished by your comment about the archetype, that the archetypal world is too much like the world of the trauma that people are already in. So that I guess you were saying the archetypes are not helpful in healing. I'm an astrologer, so I trained with a person who was also doing arts-based therapy 50 years ago, had studied with, she had learned astrology with Jung's daughter in Zurich, and also was doing sand tray and all kinds of other arts-based work here in Washington, D.C. And so I learned astrology with her. And so I'm very empathetic with what you're doing. What I find as an astrologer is that the archetypal is not just some separate world of, big powers out there. It is really the astrological experience brings together what is right at my fingertips, and what's happening in my kitchen with what's happening on the world scene, and with this world of imagination, the world of the images. And so it isn't, I can't understand not seeing the archetypal world as a partner in healing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So,
I mean, yeah, just a brief answer to that. I wasn't suggesting to throw it out. I was saying it can be a part of healing in that it illustrates traumatic experience. So if I come from my traumatic experience, I will find a mirror of that in the archetypal world, and I can sort of play with that, or I can find myself, my own experience, etc., etc. But for healing of trauma, something beyond that is necessary. But I think that's also to do with we are only currently understanding better what trauma is through neurophysiology, through neuroresearch, and how it might heal, and all that was for instance not available to Jung.
Thank you. Brian?
Oh, yeah. Hi, Birgit. I really loved your presentation. Thank you so much. I especially fascinated by the challenge of how to find words for all these things and experiences that are beyond our ordinary words and our ordinary way of approaching things. Because I'm a linguist as well as an artist, the challenge of finding words is really fascinating. And I wanted to explicitly draw a connection between your talking about trans-binarity and the term of non-duality from like Hindu Vedanta and many other contemplative or mystical traditions. And I was curious, do you see a difference between what both those terms refer to, or is it mainly about trans as in explicitly going beyond our ordinary patterns of duality?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, this is again, this is in a sense a work in progress, but at the moment, I would say that non-duality, in a sense, is a nothingness and the somethingness and the nothingness intermixed. And in the concept of trans-duality, we can have both difference and this world that I've just described. So we can have the somethingness or the sharp outlines or the sharp focus, as well as the wide focus that is in the non-binary tradition. Does that sort of clarify it a little bit?
I guess in my way of understanding non-duality personally, I feel like it's trying to make the same point that you are, that we are our individual self and everything both at once, that we're not separate between subject and object, between the one and the many, the Atman as the Brahman, like everything at once. And I feel like that's pointing to the same thing, but maybe there's a difference I'm not focusing on.
Yeah. I'm not entirely clear. I mean, in my mind, there's a little bit of a difference, but when you sort of put it like you've done now, one just would have to go on to talk about it really, to just puzzle it out.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
We have time for one more question from Lorna.
Yes, thank you so much, Birgit. I was having some images as you were talking, and strangely my mother, who was she died 10 years ago at 88 years old. She was an abstract expressionist painter, and she was working with her understanding of the quantum physicists. I'm just sort of sharing this with you because I was seeing her paintings as you were talking, and I managed to make a video of her talking about her paintings and what she was doing before she died. And I just thought, I wondered if you'd be curious to see, you know, the paintings and what she was doing.
Yes, yes, would be interesting.
I could send you the link for that.
Thank you, yes, yes.
I'd be very curious to, you know, just to see what you see, you know, to hear what you see in them from your perspectives.
Yes, thank you.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we are at time, and now is Roula's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Birgit. That was just awesome. Brilliant, Birgit. I've just put the link to your latest talk with PsyCreative. So if anybody would like to see more of Birgit's work, it's right there. And this is an amazing way, by the way, to kind of pave the way into my presentation when I talk about alchemy, because the work that you're doing, Birgit, is absolute alchemy. The poetic language, the education of the heart, the use of the heart, not rather than the brain, but, you know, the concentration on this as the center for knowledge and the art space practice. So what we're going to do now is first I'm going to share my screen, and then we will go on a little trip back in time. Okay, I need to move slides. Okay. So this presentation is titled Transcending Boundaries, the Crossroads of Arabic Alchemy, Jung, and Creative Research. So tonight, or today for some of you, I will be speaking about the contributions of Arabic and Islamic alchemy on Jungian theory. And I'm happy that art-based research is also included as a subtopic in this conference because, as a matter of fact, I find it crucial. Because when we look back at Islamic philosophy, especially the one that stemmed from the medieval times, we find that the Arab world or the Islamic world was actually the home of medieval alchemy, and also a main inspiration behind Jung's theories, who read a lot of alchemical texts from Arab alchemists. Many well-known Islamic philosophers, astronomers, mathematicians, and physicians, and other notable science figures from all sciences in the area were also artists and poets, and they took their crafts as a method for learning. Hence the integral arts-based research element over here in this conference. And I'm so happy that also Birgit mentioned poetic language, because all of the alchemists that we will be mentioning today, they were all poets without any exception. Ibn Sina, Ibn Arabi, and At-Tabari were also poets. Al-Kindi was a poet and a musician. Ibn Tufayl was a novelist, and the list goes on and on. So the Arab and Islamic world was a huge hub for arts-based research. It wasn't called arts-based research back then, but this is what it was. And it was a wonderful place to see this fusion between spirituality, art, and the sciences. Now, with the advent of Jung's studies on the nature of alchemy as a metaphor for many psychological processes, namely the individuation process, medieval alchemy played a crucial role in his psychological theories. So Jung claimed that it was the enigmatical and puzzling structure of the unconscious which brought him to alchemy. And during his practice, he noticed that his patients were producing in their dreams and fantasies symbols similar to and often identical with the symbols found in the mystery religions of antiquity, in mythology, in folklore, in fairy tales, and the apparently meaningless formulations of such esoteric cults as alchemy then. After an extensive study of these products of the unconscious, Jung discovered the collective unconscious, a form of a greater memory which has operated in and through man from the earliest periods of which we have records. And this is to quote Jung. He found in reading alchemy along the hypothesis of the collective unconscious, the activity in the human psyche, making for the spiritual development of the human being. And among many alchemical texts, Jung had read those of the Arab alchemists, namely Jabir ibn Hayyan, al-Razi, and al-Tughra'i. Alchemy, portrayed as the changing of base metals into gold, was actually the art of transformation, of perfecting or evolving a certain substance. And the science of alchemy reached its peak during the Middle Ages, especially with the translation of alchemical texts and their spreading into the Western world through the Arabs. The medieval age is roughly between the 5th and the 15th centuries, and the beginning of the period coinciding with the change from the practical to the mystical approach in alchemy. This was after the ancient alchemical scripts were saved and taken by the Nestorians to Persia and Arabia, and alchemical knowledge having spread through Babylon to the Orient. That's around the year 500 AD. Alchemical knowledge reached Europe, however, with the Moorish invasion of Spain when the Arabs came to Spain via Morocco in the year 711 AD, where they ruled for over 700 years, which was known as the Golden Age. Also, further spreading of alchemical texts throughout Europe was done with the Crusades and Templars. And what about some of the essential roles that Arabic alchemy played in the world and in the development of alchemy itself? Well, first of all, the translation was a huge thing because without translating the ancient Egyptian and Hellenic texts, then it would have been very difficult to move them also to the West. So it had to go through the translation, and then that's how it made its way to the West. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. So they actually built bridges. It was very transdisciplinary what they did because alchemists were also scientists, astronomers, mathematicians, and poets. And all that came as one package. There was no difference between the scientific method of observation and hypothesis and all that, and the spiritual aspect of the experience and also the poetic aspect of the symbolic language of alchemy. So all that was just one package. There was no divide. And they also developed methods, scientific methods, instruments. So the alchemical instruments, the alembics and all those, they were also developed by the Arab alchemists. And of course, the symbolic language of alchemy also went through a radical change when the Arab alchemists were developing it. And yes, I see them as art-based researchers, as many of you probably do. So some fun facts here. An Arab alchemist invented the camera. Ibn al-Haytham is his name, and he's considered the father of photography for building the first camera. Which was basically a sealed dark box with a pinhole lens that projected an image on the back of the box. So as you can see here in the picture, this is what it kind of looked like. The Arabs had long before discovered also the photosensitive properties of silver compounds, such as silver nitrate and silver chloride, and probably took the first crude photographs ever. So this was the work of Arab alchemists. You've heard of the term gibberish, but some of you probably don't know where it came from. It came from Jabir ibn Hayyan, who is also known in the West as Geber or Jabir. He was an alchemist, and so many alchemical terms also finally, they also originate from Arab alchemy. The word alchemy itself, it comes from al-khimya, but besides that, alcohol comes from al-kuhul, elixir comes from al-iksir, and alembic comes from al-imbiq. And the doctrines on which Arabic alchemy relied derived from the multicultural milieu of Hellenistic Egypt and included a mixture of local Christian, Hebrew, Gnostic, ancient Greek, Indian, and Mesopotamian influences. So it was very fusing in a way. It was a melting pot, just like the alchemical pot itself. In the 7th century, the Arabs started a process of territorial expansion that brought them empire and influence ranging from India to Andalusia, and fruitful contacts with ancient cultural traditions were, of course, a natural consequence of this expansion. And this was certainly the case with respect to alchemy, which had been practiced in studies in ancient Greece and Hellenistic Egypt. The Arabs arrived in Egypt to find a substantial alchemical tradition. Early written documents testify that Egyptian alchemists had developed advanced practical knowledge in the fields of pharmacology and metal, stone, and glassworking. The first translations of alchemical treatises from Greek and Coptic sources into Arabic were reportedly commissioned by Khalid ibn Yazid. We have the Arabic alchemical tradition, therefore, to thank for transmitting the legacy of the ancient and Hellenistic worlds to the Latin West.
Roula, you want to enlarge your screen. I think you wanted to have it larger.
Oh,
Mhm.
I don't know if that's possible.
Oh.
Let me see.
Meaning that
Know
we're
how to do that.
notes.
We are seeing the notes, I think. That's the
Okay.
settings.
How do I do that? Sarah, are you there?
Change the display
there a way-
settings on top.
It's totally fine. I just know that you wanted it to be full screen.
Yeah, would be a lot better if you just see the pictures.
Mhm.
So
Can you
how
go
is
on-
how is that?
Go
Display
on top,
settings
there's
at the
display
top
settings. Yeah.
over the
Settings at the
picture.
top.
Display settings, it says.
I can't see that.
Mm.
On top.
The left
you-
side,
Per-
left, towards the left.
Oh, towards the left. Yes, okay.
Mhm.
Thank you. Swap presenter view and slideshow, duplicate
Yeah.
slide.
No,
Looks
you did it when we practiced. It's okay. I just know you didn't
right.
want to see this, but it's totally fine. We can see it just
If you
fine.
don't mind, if you don't mind, then I don't
No.
mind either. It's just that I know they can be distracting. I hate it when there's a lot of words on the screen. Sorry for that.
No, it's fine. Fine.
Okay, so where were we? Khalid ibn Yazid. So it's the guy here on the right side. This is Khalid ibn Yazid. And he was the one who ordered the translation from Coptic and Greek to the Arabic. So how did they save alchemy? Arabs were ultimately responsible for preserving alchemical knowledge. As the Arabs established a new civilization throughout the empire, they assimilated a great deal of diverse cultures in a short period of time and were eager to acquire those cultures' knowledge. And from its founding around the year 750 AD, Baghdad in modern-day Iraq became a center of learning, and manuscripts from all around the world made their way to the city. And while a handful of the Alexandrian manuscripts made their way to Constantinople, most of the more important works ended up in Arabia. Many Alexandrian alchemical scrolls had already been translated into Arabic, and others were smuggled out of Egypt after Emperor Diocletian's decree of 290 AD. Around 400 AD, a mystical group of Christians known as the Nestorians saved many alchemical manuscripts by taking them to Persia and Arabia for safekeeping. The Sabians of Haran, a Syrian group of astronomers and alchemists, translated many Alexandrian alchemy texts to their native dialect before they were exiled to Mesopotamia in 489 AD. Knowledge of alchemy had spread through Babylon to the Orient around 500 AD and finally reached Europe with the Moorish invasion of Spain in 711 AD, as we mentioned earlier. At its peak, the Muslim occupation of Europe encompassed Spain, Gibraltar, and most of Portugal and southern France. Cordoba in Spain became the new center of alchemical knowledge, and Muslim, Jewish, and Christian alchemists and mystics all flocked to the city. So the Muslim alchemists knew the legend of Thoth, the Hermes of the Greeks, and called him Idris or Hermes. According to the legend, Hermes was exiled from Egypt and came to Babylon to teach. The Babylonian Hermes wrote at least 15 new books on alchemy and magic, including the Great Epistle of the Celestial Spheres. Many works by Greek philosophers were among the Arabian alchemical translations. Writings of the Alexandrian alchemists also became popular in Arabia, and many translations were made too. A group of Hermetic Muslims called the Brothers of Purity compiled an encyclopedia of alchemical theory and practice in the years between 909 and 965 AD that consolidated the diverse teachings. So the first Muslim alchemist, whose picture we saw just a minute ago, Khalid ibn Yazid, was actually initiated into alchemy by Morianos, a Christian hermit and alchemist who flourished in the mid 7th century. His student Khalid lived from 660 to 704 AD and wrote several original treatises on alchemy. Khalid's castle became a vibrant center for alchemy in the 7th century, with visiting alchemists sharing their books and discussing their ideas with each other. By the first decades of the 13th century, Arabic language, alchemical language, seems to have been completely absorbed by Latin authors who started to produce original works on alchemy, strongly influenced by what they could read in previous translations. Now, a bit of etymology. The presence of the Arabic article el in alchemy is a clear indication that of the Arabic roots of the word. Hypotheses about the etymology of the Arabic term alchimia traces the origin of the word back to the Egyptian word khem or khem, which indicated the color black and by extension the land of Egypt, which was known as the Black Land. And this is because of the fertile soil due to the flooding of the Nile. Another hypothesis links chimia to a Syriac transliteration of the Greek words chumia or chimia, meaning the art of melting metals and of producing alloys. And it is interesting to note that in contrast with the modern term alchemy, the word alchimia lacked the abstract meaning that it might have today sometimes. So not everybody knows what alchemy is, and oftentimes it's shrouded with this whole cloud of mystery. But depending on the context that it was used in back then, it could have had medical, spiritual, artistic, or even psychological meaning. In Arabic alchemical books, expressions like chimia al-sa'ada, or the way of obtaining happiness, chimia al-ghana, the way of obtaining richness, and chimia al-qulub, or the way of touching hearts, they all testify to the broad meaning of this word. What we now call alchemy was called by other words as well. It was called San'at al-Khimya, and San'a means craft, so it was actually known as the craft. Ilm al-Sina, or the knowledge of the craft or the art or the production. Al-Hikmah, which means wisdom, Sophia. Al-Amal al-Azam, or the magnum opus, the great work. Or simply As-Sana, which is the craft. So it is the craft of transformation, and it requires creative, spiritual, and mental efforts. This is what also makes it the perfect metaphor for individuation that Jung adopted. The contribution of Arabic alchemists to the history of alchemy, as we saw, is profound. They excelled also in the fields of practical laboratory experience and offered the first descriptions of some of the substances that we still use in modern chemistry, like hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, and nitric acid. They're all discoveries of Arabic alchemists. Also, soda, al-natrun, which is called al-natrun, and potassium or al-qali. Thanks to Arabic alchemy, the basic laboratory methods of distillation, sublimation, dissolution, calcination, and crystallization were greatly improved and better understood. The refining of metals and alloys was also perfected. Overall, the greatest contribution was the development of chemical apparatus and experimental techniques. The Arabs were meticulous and untiring in their experimentation and made careful written observation of their results. They designed their experiments to gather information and answer specific questions, which represented the true beginning of the scientific method, which is also used in modern psychology. However, as we can see, the scientific method was not simply an empirical experience. It was everything. It was transdisciplinary, by nature, according to the alchemists. Now, these are some of the major influences on Jungian psychology. And here this is Al-Razi, who is also known as Razis in the West. He is one influential Arabian alchemist, a physician who taught in Baghdad and lived from the years 866 to 925 AD. Razis, or Al-Razi, was an even more prolific writer than Jabir and authored 33 books on natural science, mathematics, music, medicine, and astronomy, and 48 more on philosophy, logic, and theology. He authored 21 books on alchemy, including his influential compendium of 12 treatises and The Secret of Secrets, or Kitab Sir al-Asrar, as it is called. In Latin, it is known as the Secretum Secretorum, in which he explains alchemical operations in detail and describes the equipment and ingredients needed in a medieval alchemical laboratory in a plain and clear style, unlike gibberish or Jabir's language. Al-Razi was a very accurate and systematic experimenter who produced the first classification of metals, chemicals, and other substances. He was also known as a compassionate teacher and humanitarian who personally distributed gifts to the poor and nursed the sick back to health with his own preparations. Historians of science prefer to look at his work rather than Jabir's work because Jabir's work is highly complex and too symbolic. So this is Jabir. Jabir ibn Hayyan was the greatest Arabian alchemist known. And he lived from the years 721 to 815 AD and wrote an astonishing number of books that dealt with every aspect of alchemy. Besides his Islamic studies, he was well educated in math and science. And among his most important works are 112 كتاباً, or the 112 books, which explains how to produce the elixir from vegetables and animals. Kitab al-Sab'in, or the Book of the 70, was a rich source for studying the operations and the equipment of medieval Arabic alchemy. Kutub al-Tashih, or the books on rectification, was a survey of the progress of earlier alchemists, and Kitab al-Mizan, or the Book of the Balance or Balances, in which Jabir clearly outlines the double aim of his alchemical practice as both the transmutation of bodies in the lab and the transformation of his own soul. So this is a huge leap in this whole area of alchemy, and this again is another clear example of transdisciplinarity and the main metaphor behind Jung's individuation theory. He also translated dozens of alchemy manuscripts and saved many original texts that had been lost when the Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed. Jabir was also a fanatical experimenter, and his practical guides to alchemy included the refining of metals and preparing steel, dyeing of cloths and leather, the making of varnishes to protect cloth and iron, writing with gold ink from pyrites, glassmaking, using manganese dioxide, distilling acetic acid from vinegar, and producing lead carbonate, arsenic, and antimony from their sulfides. Jabir corrected experimental errors and references in the works of Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek philosophers, and developed his own complex numerological system of scientific alchemy. So he was also a numerologist. However, Jabir was so careful to conceal the true principles of alchemy that his works rarely made sense to outsiders, and the term gibberish originally referred to his writings. Nonetheless, to the initiated, Jabir is still held in the highest esteem. And At-Tughra'i, although not quoted by Jung as much as Al-Razi and Jabir, was a widely respected alchemist, born in 1063 AD. He wrote many important books and poems on alchemy. He claimed to have gotten his esoteric knowledge directly from Hermes, and indeed his work was very sophisticated and can also only be understood by advanced students. Tughra'i's most famous work is Masabih al-Hikmah wa Mafatih al-Rahmah, which means the lanterns of wisdom and the keys of mercy. And again, Birgit, I can't help but remembering when you mentioned about the merciful language or merciful knowledge of the heart. So that's where he presents ancient Hermetic teachings and theories of alchemy. So Jung found in alchemy an early expression of psychology. And by the way, so many people regard Al-Razi as the father, the original father of psychology. This is probably where Jung picked it up as a metaphor for mental work. And the profound, I'm quoting Jung here, the profound darkness that shrouds the alchemical procedure comes from the fact that although the alchemist was interested in the chemical part of the work, he also used it to devise a nomenclature for the psychic transformation that really fascinated him. Jung had found in the invention of their unique terminology of alchemists, like the gibberish of Jabir, the earliest form of a psychiatric system of classification that describes one's inner transformation. Jung then gathered a vast number of original alchemical texts, perhaps the largest compilation in Europe, and appreciated alchemy as a dynamic system exploring the nature of the unconscious. In his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung asserts that alchemy as a nature of philosophy of great consideration in the Middle Ages throws a bridge to the past and their gnosis, and also to the future, the modern psychology of the unconscious. What sparked Jung... Okay, we're almost done. What sparked Jung's interest in alchemy was a combination of his own dream experiences and those of his patients, both of which displayed alchemical images and principles. Jung had a recurring dream that started years before he studied alchemy. It's one of his famous dreams. In the dream, he was captive of the 17th century, and there appeared to be an unexplored chamber next to his house that had been there for about a long time without him knowing about it. Then it dawned on Jung that his dream was referring to alchemy, for in the 17th century, alchemy reached its climax. He came to interpret the dream as a message from his subconscious, helping him find a suitable discipline that would become a framework for his work on the unconscious. The dream was telling Jung that the subconscious mind can reveal itself best through studying medieval alchemy. And eventually, Jung discovered that his interpretation of the dream proved true to him. His studies showed that alchemical operations were actually at work in the mind. Only by discovering alchemy have I clearly understood that the unconscious is a process and that ego's rapports with it and its contents initiate an evolution, more precisely, a real metamorphosis of the mind. In addition to a subject's personal unconscious, Jung believes in the collective unconscious, as most of us know, a common impersonal unconscious which has agency across different historical epochs and cultural boundaries. Jung perceives the collective unconscious as a universal soul, referring to a shared impersonal inherited memory containing deposits of the constantly repeated experiences of humanity. The contents of the collective unconscious, according to Jung, were similar to individuals everywhere. And the collective unconscious mainly consists of a collection of what Jung calls archetypes, nameless until they become symbols of representation. And we just spoke about how symbolic the language of alchemy is, therefore how archetypally charged it can be. Archetypes are a priori possibilities, phylogenetically inherited predispositions to apperceive a universal emotional core human experience, myth, or thought image fantasy. An archetype can never be exactly pinpointed or apprehended because it exists in such a primitive formal state. So archetypes, however, become known when they are manifested as images. And the language of alchemical texts with its enigmatic, aesthetic, and symbolic aspects is highly archetypal. So the alchemists, or as-sana, or the craft workers, as the Arabs would have also called themselves, engage with images, psychic images that concretize through symbols and manifest in the development of the tools that led to modern chemistry and medicine. The development of Arab alchemists, therefore, was heavily reliant on engagement with these collective unconscious contents or archetypal energies. One essential alchemical text, the Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet, attributed to her Mistress Majestus, caught the attention of Jung. Jung asserts that its importance can hardly be overestimated, for it had an enormous influence on medieval alchemy. However, it also offers a precursor to depth psychology. A pictorial view, one that we can see here on the left, of the Emerald Tablet was created by Matthew Marion, would best express its principles. This engraving drew Renaissance alchemists' attention to its hermetic symbols, also focusing on the notion of al-fasl, which al-Tughra'i proposed. Upon looking at it, one notices that the engraving has been divided into a lower and an upper hemisphere. The upper hemisphere portrays the spiritual realm, that of light and divine union. The lower hemisphere illustrates the material realm, that of matter and duality. So the earth, material existence, and polarities of Sol and Luna. Above the horizon, there are two, not one, suns rising, with the larger background and sun representing the one mind and its rays encompassing the whole universe. To the front of the one mind is a smaller sun called Mind the Maker. However, that's contrary to religious beliefs that pervaded the Middle Ages. It implies that God does not interfere directly in our world. So instead, it shows the notion that the word of God is what the Emerald Tablet calls a pattern projected into reality. These are represented in the engraving by the angels shown in the smaller sun, if you can see it. These cherubs are later on interpreted by Jung as representations of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Thus, the one mind creates Mind the Maker, which actually creates through the archetypes or the crystallized thoughts of God. In the lower hemisphere of the figure, the duality of existence is shown in the left and right sections, where the sunny left depicts the masculine solar and the dark right section shows the lunar feminine. In the middle of the lower hemisphere is the hermaphroditic Hermes, holding two axes with which he cut the chain that ties us with the world below in order to realize the power of the archetypal forces above. And this is something that also Jung used in one of his lectures. And this is the last slide. Interest in mental alchemy, as we said, began in the 18th century when alchemists asserted that this type of work happens in the salt or material realm, which is, according to Jung, the personality. The salt in alchemy, it was an idea also introduced by Al-Razi. It refers to the crystallization of energy into set structures, and retrieving that energy requires dissolving the salt or the personality and purifying it to reflect who we really are. With that, judgments and suppressions dissolve and mental transformation begins. At this first step in alchemy, the alchemist needs to recognize and isolate the first matter, which represents the dark, irrational forces of the subconscious mind, which contain all the potential energy and dynamic oppositions needed to fuel a person's transformation. Jung saw this as the personal unconscious, or the shadow, which is the subject in need for transformation. The process of mental alchemy thus transforms this part of the person from the fragmented and distorted state into a unified, balanced whole. Now, another influence by Jabir's Book of Balances, Jung saw that the first matter is in the vessel of the mind. This, again, was not a purely Jungian idea, but it originated with Jabir. The mind is a sealed inner lab where energies must be safely contained and worked on without contaminating the personality. That's because in the process, heat from the intense fires of introspection increasing with it the pressure of the vessel. Then, because of too much liquid or emotions in the vessel, matter tends to putrefy. And what the subject must do here is to divorce himself from these feelings and emotions in order to work more with fire or objective consciousness. The result would be an evaporative process when emotional energy is driven off, impurities are removed, and the solution of the self is purer to work on. In terms of Jungian psychology, however, Jung interprets the dangers of this stage. The contents of the personal unconscious, or the shadow in this case, are indistinguishably merged with the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious and drag the latter with them when the shadow is brought into consciousness. This may exert an uncanny influence on the conscious mind, for activated archetypes have a disagreeable effect, even, or as he said, should perhaps say, particularly on the most cold-blooded rationalist. So,
if we are into question time now, sorry. You
yeah,
can carry on if
okay,
you want.
it's
You
fine.
can carry
It's
on and
okay.
finish.
I mean, it's just a summing up of everything I said, so that's okay. I can stop here. Thank you so much. And let me see how I can stop sharing.